Hey everybody, Professor Benelou here with the second of two short videos explaining Unit 4 DB. In this portion, we will be talking about the four topics you can choose from. Remember, you're going to be analyzing a primary document just like you did in Unit 2 DB. And a primary document is a document that was written during the time period you are studying. So in the first topic, which covers Reaganomics, you are going to be analyzing an article which is Ronald Reagan explaining the passage or discussing the passage of two important economic laws that he had just signed into effect. So anyway, Reaganomics, basically the gist of Reaganomics, what you need to know about Reaganomics is this. When Reagan was sworn into office in January 1981, the economy was suffering from inflation and slow economic growth. Reagan wanted to increase the amount of spending money every American had in his or her pocket. So he instituted what was called Reaganomics. The press dubbed his economic program Reaganomics. Reagan put into place tax cuts for the wealthy and reasoned that the wealth would trickle down to the lower and middle classes if you cut the taxes for the wealthy. Reagan was a huge fan of smaller government, and he felt that the middle class would be benefited from more simplified tax codes. He cut about $41 billion from the federal budget, which was a lot. And a lot of that had to do with social programs, had to be funding for social programs. Supply side economics was a big part of Reaganomics. Supply side economics was the belief that cutting taxes will benefit the big businesses and the middle class. So if you cut taxes for the big businesses, the wealth will again trickle down to the lower and middle classes. Okay, Tax Equity and Responsibility Act. Reagan is interviewed about the passage of this law in your primary document, so pay attention to this. This law closed tax loopholes and restricted benefits and pension plans. This was Reagan's way of generating income for the federal government without having to raise taxes. He didn't want to raise taxes. Taxes are a bad word for conservative Republicans, so he didn't want to raise taxes. The Tax Equity and Responsibility Act helped out somewhat, but not as much as hoped. The gap between the rich and the poor, you have to remember, continually grew throughout Reagan's years in office. To really gauge whether Reaganomics was successful, you got to see how the lower middle classes fared during Reaganomics. Reagan did not increase the minimum wage during his presidency, and he cut federal funding for firefighters, policemen, education, all of that during his 8 years in office. Single mother and African American households saw their income decline the most during Reaganomics. And in 1984, Reagan further slashed the tax rates of the wealthy, causing an even larger budget deficit. The budget deficit, or the federal debt, would really grow during his second term of office, 1985 to 1989, because Reagan was very, very focused on funding the military, and in particular his Star Wars programs. All right, so that is the first topic. The second topic that you can choose from is the first Gulf War. And the primary document that you will be analyzing is a speech that was given by President George H.W. Bush in October of 1990 regarding Iraqi aggression. And we're going to get into that a little bit in 1 minute. So let me just give you a little background on the first Gulf War first to start out. August 2nd, 1990, a little over 30 years ago, Iraqi forces invaded and took over Kuwait. Kuwait is a very oil-rich nation, and President Bush demanded immediately the withdrawal of Iraqi forces from Kuwait. What you have to understand, my dear students, is the United States in the first Gulf War was the head of United Nations coalition forces. Saudi Arabia accepted U.S. coalition forces into the country, or I should more accurately say UN coalition forces, into their country. They were the base for UN coalition forces. And the Saudis gladly allowed us to do that because they felt they were next to be invaded by the Iraqis. They figured, well, we're an oil-rich nation too, so what the heck, they'll probably invade us next. Since the U.S. had previously been an ally of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq, felt that the U.S. would not intervene militarily when he invaded Kuwait. He greatly miscalculated. Coalition forces quickly liberated Kuwait and headed into Iraq. Even though coalition forces had won the war, Saddam Hussein remains in power. George H.W. Bush gave this important speech in front of the United Nations General Assembly on October 1st, 1990. This speech occurred about 2 months after the invasion and takeover of Kuwait by the Iraqis. In this speech, Bush condemned the Iraqi aggression and called on the UN to demand a return of Kuwait to the Kuwaitis. He said that the United Nations can aid nations to band together to prevent aggression and punish those countries responsible. Third topic you can go over is the tear down this wall speech. This is an important speech that Reagan gave in June of 1987 in front of the Berlin Wall. And during this speech, he urged an end to the Cold War with democracy spreading through the nations that were formerly under communist rule. And he emphasized the hardships that Berliners, particularly East Berliners and East Germans, had suffered since the wall had been built in 1961, 26 years earlier. So, I'll give you a little background on the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War. The dismantling of the wall began in November 1989 with the collapse of the communist East German government. For quite some time before November 1989, the economy in East Germany was on the decline. Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev urged the East Germans to impose economic reforms like he had done in the Soviet Union. Many East Germans were flocking to embassies wanting to be let into West Germany. November 1989, East German leader Erich Honecker resigned and East Germans were let into West Germany. So basically, a lot of people felt Reagan's speech influenced the tearing down of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the East German government. Do you feel that way? Delve into that. Okay, the last topic you can go into the primary document is news footage of the stock market crash of October 1987. So if you want to dive into that one, let me just give you a little background into the stock market crash of 87. Monday, October 19, 1987 was known as Black Monday. The values of stocks were plummeting to a staggering 20%. Chairman of the Federal Reserve was Alan Greenspan, and he tried to slash interest rates to prevent the crash from becoming much worse. Before the crash in 1987, the stock market was absolutely booming, and computer trading with stocks was incredibly popular. It's called program trading, large volume stock trading over the computer. State pension funds and large institution funds put in automatic stock orders. The index arbitrage. Traders use this using computers to determine when a stock's price will be low enough to make a wise purchase. Because if you play your cards right on the stock market, you want to buy low when the stock price is low and you want to sell when the stock price is high. So before the stock market crash, interest rates were rising and the U.S. trade deficit was growing. October 18, 1987, investors held off buying and triggered a program trade. A program trade is automatic buying and selling from large institutions. The sell-off that resulted from the program trade led to calling in a margin loans. A margin loan is borrowing using stock as credit. So there was a lot of these loans called in. A margin call is calling in loans that use stock as collateral. So there were a lot of margin calls. And a large amount of margin calls caused few investors to have money to plow back into the market. And this caused the crash. So that is the last topic you can go over. I hope these 2 videos have helped. Find the one that interests you the most, the topic that interests you the most, and dive into it. And please feel free to ask me absolutely any questions. All right, everybody, good luck.